So, hello. We've got a lot of people showing up for the last session of our time together here.
Yeah, hi again, everyone. It's Jody. Sorry I've missed the last couple. Just different life things going on.
Good to see you. Yeah, there's a lot. Life is a thing.
Life always gets in the way, right? Of plans.
It does. It does. I've been having some I've been having some fun because I have I kind of hope Tracy comes too, because she's been doing a lot of sort of changing up the way that she's kind of thinking about doing stuff, and I'm curious about that.
So I thought next week was the last one.
Next week could be the last one if we want to continue.
Okay.
Do we want to continue?
Yeah, I do.
All right. Yep. I'm happy. Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to go with it. We can have we can talk about the articles today, and then and actually something that just popped up that Chris stuck in the Obsidian notes of the Schmidt article, right? Yeah, Johannes Schmidt. He noticed that the section 9 of the second Luhmann zettelkasten is now available in full in German and English. So I started looking at those, and actually I was thinking I might. Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll do another session. I just saw Lewis voted in the chat too. I was thinking I would go through that. I kind of glanced at them, but I maybe I'll sit with them for a little bit longer and think more about what it is exactly that he's doing and that he's getting at in those, because I thought that might be an interesting way to kind of compare. That might be something interesting to compare to some of the things that he has said in the 1981 article and in the 1987 interview, which are kind of the two major times that he I think published something outward facing about the zettelkasten. But the stuff that he did inside is interesting as well, because when he mentions I think it's 9/8G, he mentions this that the famous quote, right? You can't think without writing. And then he qualifies that, and he says, at least not in contexts that require selective access to memory. And then he elaborates more, and he says that also means you can't think without, and I assume what they're saying here is noticing differences. They misspell it. Tiago's book, Building a Second Brain, is out this June. we could Hi, Tracy. That's okay. We'll wait for you. We could look at Tiago's book. I assume that he is going to put a lot of the stuff that he has been charging the big bucks for into it in an effort to reach an even broader market. It was kind of interesting. I'm not a big fan, I will say, just because I'm going to mention a controversial figure. I'm not a big fan of the controversial Canadian, but I did see on there was a Joe Rogan podcast, and and the psychology professor was on there, and he said that he was thinking that maybe he didn't want to write another book. And this has been something that has been interesting me for quite a while, right? The idea of the consolidation of trade publishing into just a few ways to go, and and that somebody who has a couple of bestsellers would be questioning the efficacy of going that way, and saying, well, I can reach 1 million people by going on the Rogan podcast, or I can spend 2 years and write a book. I think that this is the controversial Canadian is what's his name now? Now I'm going to draw a blank. It'll come to me in just a second.
You might mean Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson, thank you. Yes, that's who it is. Yeah, so Jordan Peterson, who is who's not my favorite for a lot of reasons, but I thought it was interesting. I mean, he has a couple of bestsellers. They weren't books that I found particularly interesting, but he did very well with them. And the idea, now it may be that he's just having trouble finding a mainstream publisher now that he's become even more controversial. So maybe it's a kind of a sour grapes thing. But on the other hand, I think it does sort of raise that question about, what if you want to reach people. And I've been sort of thinking about this, I guess, for quite a long time because I was in the computer business for quite a while. And then also just because I thought, before I had any type of platform, it was hard for me to attract anybody to think about talking to me about a non, he does have his own podcast. I think that is, I think there's synergy there, and Rogan probably brings him to an audience even wider than and more diverse than his own. But the idea that that maybe it is worth considering now, even for somebody like that there may be ways, there may be other ways to get to a public. Certainly it's behind a paywall, right? Because he's not doing it for his, and that's the thing is the Rogan podcast is not. So it is it's a promotional thing, right? It's a giveaway, right? Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson are two of the dumbest people on earth. Okay, are you actually quoting somebody there, Nate?
Yeah, that's from the Rolling Stone article that I dropped in there.
Oh, okay.
I worry about the world that like both of these people have as much popularity as they do, because it's like if you have even like the smallest amount of critical thinking, like it's almost impossible to listen to either of these individuals talk for any extended period of time. It's just like I don't know.
I would say, I guess for myself, that I oftentimes don't listen because it's just not something that I'm interested in. I never listened I never listened directly to Peterson, and I occasionally listen to Rogan. I think that it is, I guess the thing that I would say about that is that I think probably the reason for that is the unfortunate tendency of, kind of the mainstream media to have sort of fallen down on the job in the last several years. Rogan is the guy that Neil Young temporarily removed his songs from Spotify in protest of. And then, of course, it turns out apparently that because Neil doesn't own his songs, they're back on Spotify. So whoops. It's but in any case, my point was not really to endorse either of those, but to say that going out in different ways to publics, I think, is something that is becoming increasingly possible. Another example of that is that I started actually, I sort of went back and I've been pulling a lot of my old research off of, kind of backup hard drives. And so I started actually working on that and putting it up and actually what I did was I made a folder inside my vault so that I could look at just that, because I do somehow feel attracted to that idea of having that stuff in one place and seeing that, sort of mini graph grow and develop connections of its own and things. So I started putting up, I've been sort of for the last 15, 16 years, off and on researching secular radicals. And that includes, and transatlantically. And so I started putting that up, and I found this guy who is out there with he has a WordPress site that has a bunch of these, a bunch of early 19th century radical and secular publications, like the Free Inquirer in New York, and a bunch of other similar ones in the first few decades of the 19th century, and it's out there, and that really that kind of reminded me that this is a way to go out to the public, and it was something that I was able to find with a quick search, and so I thought, well, maybe this is still a thing, and it's not entirely just the case that only social media and Twitter and and Facebook get any attention. So that was so that just sort of brought me back to that question, ongoing question of this kind of shift from publishing to to other forms. So who is Guri? Justin, do you want to fill us in?
Sorry, I was in the chat and holding the space bar just adds spaces in the chat. He was an analyst, I think, in the intelligence department for a long time, and then saw a lot of everybody raising complaints about public figures and finding all their dirty laundry. Used to be gate kept by the mainstream media, and in the modern era with the internet, it no longer is. So nobody is actually. The two main problems are we don't have a common agreed set of facts, which maybe that wasn't a good thing in the past. And we also don't have any this is really paraphrasing what he says, but we don't have any heroes we can believe in anymore because they all are tainted. And so no people are happy about anything anymore. And he doesn't propose a solution, but that's his argument for why things are so challenging these days.
Yeah, it's kind of, it is wild, right? Walter Cronkite used to be the most trusted man in America, right? When there was one channel of information, and we weren't quite as aware, that maybe consent was being manufactured in that space, but also, right, because of that single channel, or at least the three competing networks, competing for all eyeballs kind of dynamic, right? Then there was a sort of a rush to the center, right? That you didn't polarize, right? And you didn't go out of your way to make your message extreme, because now the business model is completely different. So now in this huge space, we can look for, and that was actually the thing that was sort of occurring to me as I was finding this guy's, website on these publications as well. As he works in Texas or some university in the South as a professor of law librarianship and a law librarian. So he serves the law school at his university, and he also teaches about how to be a law librarian. And so the thing that he's doing is very narrow, but the available market is global, right? So that does kind of create an interesting dynamic there. But it's the problem probably that also leads to this, polarization. The idea of consensus is, was probably very artificial, but it was awfully comforting, right?
We also don't have like a strong outside enemy to rally against, like during the Cold War currently. So that also presents a problem for unifying the public.
Yeah. So, yeah, although who knows, maybe in a few weeks we will. How are things going on the other side of the pond? How's the feeling in adjacent to the European conflict?
Well, here in Finland, we're watching with interest, I guess you have to say, and I guess the standard Finnish position has been to be outside of NATO, kind of not neutral, part of European Union, but to be kind of a little bit separated from that kind of Cold War kind of setup. And I guess they're pushing us. Russia's going to push Finland and Sweden closer to NATO by doing this. So
yeah,
let's see how it goes.
Yeah, it does seem like there will be response. I was actually we have occasional I guess bi-weekly campus. Ever since COVID started, our campus has these campus forum meetings, and I was contacted yesterday. They said, "Would you, as a historian, would you say something about Ukraine?" And I was thinking, well, okay, I guess I could. I'll say something about the history of the relationship between the Russian Empire and Ukraine, or and especially the Soviet Union and Ukraine. I mean, there are probably people still alive, who remember the 30s. So I think that probably has a little bit of resonance that that isn't immediate media related.
Yeah, and here in the UK, a lot of us are not very happy about the government response. Like mostly because they're pulling up the drawbridge and not letting any Ukrainians refugees through, and also can we mention about how the Russian millionaires have come to London and have donated to the Tory party. So the kind of government is kind of like publicly saying they support Ukraine, but secretly we're wondering if they're practically we're wondering if they're secretly supporting Russia behind the back because of all their donors and the Russian oligarchy money.
Yeah. Well, and it'll be interesting to see how the whole energy situation plays out too. Okay, but in any case, we didn't come here to talk about the world situation, I suppose. So, Tracy, I was very interested. I'm glad you're here. I was very interested in kind of the change you were making to your process. I thought we might talk a little bit about about process first, and then jump over to the articles. So, do you want to kind of summarize the things you've been doing a lot?
Well, I fell off the zettelkasten bandwagon. That's basically what I did. So I started out kind of thinking, oh yes, this is what I need, and then got bogged down in the book, and I did skim the articles, but can't say that I'm really all about that for today. So I was planning on just being quiet and trying to listen and maybe be reconverted. I don't know. I think I came to this realization. First of all, that my reflection on this was happening in sort of sprints, right? Like I first was on the zettelkasten bandwagon, or at least very sympathetic, learning, open. Okay, how can I use this? And then I went, okay, now how am I actually going to apply this, and what are my issues with it, and how does it, where are the kind of sticking points for my sort of process? That was sort of sprint 2. And then somewhere along the way, I realized that, man, I really just have to push stuff out. And what I really care about as I'm developing my thought, linking my thinking, doing all these things, is what I've already written, and how do we go to the next step without losing track of the conversation with the sources. So then I realized that, well, what I really need to do is push stuff out and take the stuff that I've written in public and put it back in my vault and keep going. So that's kind of where I am right now. So I like many of the kind of insights of Luhmann and Ahrens into what you need to be productive, kind of. And, you know, he goes off kind of in a psychology productivity way, whereas it's more like the idea of kind of sitting with your slip box. But in my case, would be sitting with what I've already been writing and working on, and then continuing to be productive around that, rather than, you know, building out this kind of middle, as I've been thinking about it, where you're reading sources, then you have this big middle, and then out of that is going to fall out all of these publishable things like Luhmann did. Rather, I don't see myself with a middle, which kind of defeats the whole purpose. I want to just kind of think in public almost, as much as I can, and then bring that back in, and then kind of keep it going without losing the conversation from the sources. So I think that's kind of what happened to me. And in the meantime, I've been learning more about Obsidian just as a tool, realizing that for it to be frictionless, to reduce, you know, just kind of make the habit easier, the kind of, I need to master the tool. So I don't have to be constantly thinking about it, or being frustrated because it doesn't do this or that, or the bullets aren't lining up, or, you know, I get distracted by, you know, I guess I'm a more perfectionist than I would want to admit. So I really need to learn Obsidian and be facile with it, so that it doesn't get in my way. And then I think Chris was saying that I also am really battling when to have more than one tool and how the tools work together, because there isn't a perfect one. And you either have to live with the frustrations of using one thing so that everything's in one place and you've mastered one thing, or you bend it out of shape to make it do something that you really need, or you have to cope with the problem of having multiple tools and then a more complicated workflow and getting them to talk with each other and have the same formats. So just on a very practical tool-based level, that's been part of my week too. So been a busy week. I appreciate feedback, but I apologize. I kind of dropped off the crusade.
Well, I think your observation about kind of working with the garage door open was, kind of very resonant for me, because I do feel very motivated by that idea that I'm going to talk about sort of what I'm processing almost in real time, right? And that, and I have had doubts about that, well, maybe, that means that the things that I'm producing are only going to be in that kind of form, right? In the form that is amenable to a blog post or or a video script, right? And that somehow is going to determine, sort of the depth of my thinking about an issue or the size of my response to a text or something like that. But I do think that it's also a way to maybe find out what things actually interest other people, right? And sort of the types of like Chris, when you put the section 9 of Luhmann zettelkasten in the links, I thought that I started reading those. I may have mentioned just before you popped in, and I found them very fascinating, because I found them to be kind of like a little bit more look behind the curtain than maybe I got in the 1981 article or the 1987 interview. And then I thought, oh, maybe I'll make a video about that. Maybe I'll kind of go through and respond to that in some type of a form. And I'm wondering if that, if that's a good thing, I guess, or a bad thing. So one of the things that I actually had to prepare my students for midterms this week, and the way that I'm doing the midterm really is kind of focused around having each of my survey classes write a 5-paragraph essay about a topic. Then they'll get to choose from a couple of different prompts, but I had to sort of explain to them and kind of have a discussion session where we talked about what a 5-paragraph essay was. And so part of that, it did sort of make me think about it a little bit. And I do kind of think that the paragraph is sort of the basic unit of thought. And if that's the case, then what's actually in a paragraph? And one of the things that interested me about those Luhmann Section 9 things is that he sort of writes and then he kind of summarizes what he's written and he underlines it, right? So there are these notes that have kind of thoughts, and then they have a statement. And so, which is kind of a paragraph in reverse, but still interesting as a kind of a unit of thinking. So do we want to talk about, thanks for the video, Simon. I haven't seen that one. And actually, that book that just came out, the new little zettelkasten book, I also haven't seen, but I did ask my ILL people to find that. For me. So maybe a combination of that, something like that, if that turns out to be interesting, and and whatever it is that Tiago produces, and that won't be till June though, I think, right? That comes out in mid-June. Yeah. Actually, I was thinking next of maybe bouncing back. I was thinking kind of a bouncing back and forth from sort of note-taking texts to and process kind of conversations to texts. And I was thinking that maybe the next one might be, I did a poll and it seemed like the more people wanted to talk about debt, the other Graeber book. But if anybody has opinions about that. But in the meantime, what about these two articles? We've got firstly, we've got the Luhmann one, which I had read, I guess, in about a year ago, and and returned to kind of this week. So Stan, yeah, a couple of the comments of mine that you were responding to were a year old, but I think probably still apply.
Simon, you had your hand up there.
Oh,
it looks like Chris has something he wants to say too.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I missed that.
And then I pulled my hand down because I haven't had time to read the articles, so I had nothing to say about them.
Well, what else? I mean, you had something to say before that, though. So what was that?
Well, it was because I wasn't sure that because I had internet issues, and I think Tracy, I just wanted to get a sense of what it was that what it is that you're going to. Like, I mean, I don't have any sort of skin in the game in terms of whether you use zettelkasten or not, or whether it's a true version of it or anything like that. But do you have a feeling like there's something coming up for you in terms of some sort of method that's useful, and what is that? And maybe you already described that and I missed it because of my internet stuff.
Well, I mean, I think the only method I'm going to be involved in the next couple months at least is just experimenting. I mean, the other part of what my revelation for Sprint 3 was, in order to actually kind of produce and push out writing projects that then can come back and be the spur to continued thinking. I mean, it touches a lot on what Dan was just saying about, okay, well, what's the genre the rhetorical genre of the thing you're producing. Is it a blog post? Is it a class lecture? Is it a YouTube video? And then, so how, first of all, like, how do you just crank those out productively and in a quality way? But then how does that fit back into your system? So the other piece of kind of writing I did in our vault for this week was just try to start thinking about what are sort of rhetorical workflows. And this is basing off of sort of the model of the ancients, where, you know, or Aristotle and the classical rhetoricians, where their whole educational system was geared towards training them to follow a certain pattern of developing certain rhetorical genres, speeches basically, but specific kinds of speeches with specific kinds of content, with you know, culturally coded types of material and figures of speech and arrangement and all the rest. So if we did that today, like, what would that look like? So part of my project this week was to say, okay, well, how can I adapt that sort of general historical process of kind of training myself, forming myself to work in certain genres that both allows me to publish, write, get stuff out. And by publish, I just mean get it out there. I don't mean, you know, academic publishing or anything like that, but just pushing stuff out into public, but that have it still be useful to continue to work on. So there's a big question of kind of wrestling with different genres, cultural genres, and how they're both productive for thinking and productive for engaging in a more public conversation, as well as conversation with myself and conversation with the sources. So that's kind of a model or method that I'm working towards, and everything probably for at least the short term foreseeable future will be just experiments in that direction.
Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the ones that I've been sort of most focused on just in the last week or so has been evidence and argument, right? But yeah, Chris, you've been waiting patiently.
And it hopefully is relevant to this, because I've been, as you say, you're working in, you know, with your garage door open in public, and Tracy is kind of looking to do that as well. For most of the past 2 years, I've been following it. It's not grown up around the idea of zettelkasten, but came along with it and with most of these tools. But there are a lot of people in the space that are kind of self-identifying with the phrase digital gardens. Mm-hmm. That goes back to a Mark Bernstein website from 1998, I think. And then there's another article by Mike Caulfield called Techno Pastoral, and I'll put some links in the thing in a minute. But I've been watching a bunch of people. You watch social media, and a lot of people are talking about productivity and PKM and zettelkasten and reading this stuff, and I feel more like people are nibbling at the edges. But very few I find who are working in public are actively creating a zettelkasten. Typically what's happening more is they're following a Wikipedia model or a wiki model, and they're building longer pages and articles from the jump. And one of the few who's closer to a public zettelkasten model is Andy Matuszak, who has a Curious Fun wiki. And his ideas typically are 1 or 2 paragraphs long in little window panes. And I think in the idea of form following function, more the people I see who are working in a more atomic idea zettelkasten model are using either their own tools that force small cards, or things like FedWiki, which is built by Ward Cunningham, who's the inventor of the wiki or the digital wiki, or they're using something like TiddlyWiki, which is a card-based thing. And those interfaces are kind of forcing you to write small, tiny things rather than big page-long things. Mm-hmm. And to me, the usefulness of it is if you can extract an interesting idea from something you read into a small 2 or 3 sentence or paragraph level and cross-link it with other things, you can then use the links as a pathway through to create an article or multiple articles. In fact, I noticed a few minutes ago, Johannes Schmidt, and I don't know if he's actually using his own zettelkasten while he's studying Luhmann's zettelkasten, but he has a German introduction on the digital zettelkasten page that is almost exactly or fairly similar, but shorter to the article for this week. And then he's got another article that's twice as long as that appears in
Forgetting Machines.
In Cravali's book about forgetting.
Yeah.
So he's written the same thing 3 times and added different amounts of material to it. And oddly, I had the same experience yesterday in reading about Supreme Court nominees. The same 30 sub ideas or facts appear in almost every article. But even worse, that wasn't the Wall Street Journal, I read the AP Wire. So the AP had 4 big articles on the topic from 4 different perspectives, but substantively, they all had exactly the same details. They were just written in, here's a different path through this information. And it was actually almost kind of annoying that from an editorial perspective, they had these 4 articles with different headlines. And it was almost like they were A/B testing an article, what's going to get the most attention here. But we're going to say the same thing 4 different times and give it 4 different headlines to see what you as a reader might like to read, which is a way of looking at this zettelkasten as a means of using things. So if you're a journalistic output thing, you can say, here's a topic, here's a bunch of facts, and how do we string these together with slightly different perspectives or ideas on what somebody may be looking for. But to me, that's the value. But I see almost everyone who's doing this in public, who you can go and look at something online as an example, they're all wikis. They're not, almost none of them are actual zettelkasten. So it's, everybody's talking about zettelkasten, almost no one is actually doing it, is what I'm seeing.
So yeah, it does seem like there's a marketing element involved there, right? But even the kind of a TLDR element as well, right? That, well, okay, I have this much to say about it. I might not be able to get you to read it all, or I'm constrained, in the word count that they gave me for this article or something like that. So I will edit. So there's an interesting editorial function there. One of the things that I also wonder about as these things become atomic, though, is the question of, well, how much at what point does something, cease to be a direct discussion of something or a direct explanation of something and become a metaphor, right? And and I find this oftentimes in scientific theories that become scientific reporting or journalism or sort of pop science books, and kind of oftentimes get to a point of summarization that that they actually become unmoored from their original context, and then can be repurposed into something like, I guess the classic example that I always keep going back to is Dawkins, and taking all of that genetic stuff that he's talking about and creating this idea of memetics, right? Which I think is still, I haven't gone back to the literature recently, but last time I looked at it, it was still very unclear whether people were taking that as a metaphor or actually believing in the reality of memes. So I think that's kind of problematic, isn't it? Tracy, go ahead.
Actually, that's a fascinating question because one of the things, not a conclusion, but a intuition that I came to in studying a lot of classical texts is that in the ancient world, I don't think they had this understanding of a split between what we today would probably call a heuristic or an interpretation or a metaphor, and the quote literal truth, the empirical truth. In other words, the form and content were much more intrinsically interwoven. So that, I mean, and this comes up, for example, in interpretation of scripture, where you know, it's only a modern problem to say, are you a literalist or are you kind of, is it all a metaphor, right? And that you wouldn't have had even that debate. You couldn't have stood on one side or the other of that debate in the pre-modern world. They all understood it was a metaphor and they all understood it was true, because that was the only way that was the only genre, the only rhetorical genre you could use to express the kinds of things you were trying to say. And so the ancient world was so steeped in rhetoric that there just wasn't an empirical, scientific, literal, historical kind of mindset that we just take for granted today. So I think that I don't know what that has to do with zettelkastens exactly, or note taking or creating either long form or short form or unique new kind of interlinked genres, pathways. Again, we have a metaphor. But I think it's very possible that the internet is going to bring us back to more of a pre-modern mindset, in that the genre, the rhetorical form, is going to be just as important as the content. So this is, what is it? The medium is the message and that kind of thing. I don't know.
Well, it does seem though that in the ancient world, there was more of a belief in a direct connection between words and things, right? That things were real, and you know that things and ideas were equally real and were in relationship with with each other, right? That is something maybe that we have that we've lost, right? That now maybe we think that there is an objective reality out there, and there's a subjective experience that we each have, and then we use language, right, to somehow communicate about that. But we've had the cultural turn, so we have to deal with our understanding of language and not believe that we are talking about reality in the same way that we would have back then, right?
Right. I mean, it's very instructive if you just think about Platonism, right? So what's more real? The Platonic idea, the right. Form, that metaphysical thing, and everything in the world is just kind of an ephemeral copy of that. It's not as real because it's ephemeral. It passes in and out of being. It's always becoming, right? Never is, right? Versus today, I mean, as kind of more scientifically minded, it's like the real thing is the concrete thing, the material thing that you can measure, that you can, sense, that you can, put your hands on. And so the question is, how do you negotiate what's fleeting with what's real? And if what's real is an idea, right, then that's a very different way of thinking than if what's real is what's physically present in front of you. And an ideal is the ephemeral thing. That's, our thoughts are fleeting. They're coming and going. And it's like, I was watching that video with the guy who's the log seek people. And he's like, and what's his YouTube handle? Something like a one stuttering mind or something. So what's mental is like totally ephemeral and not real. And it's the physical world that's real. Versus the ancient world, it would have been the other way around. And that's why they could worship reason and rationality and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Although ironically, we have persistent identities and we replace all of our cells and atoms, every 7 to 10 years. And so physically we're not what we thought we were. Justin.
It's not directly related, but the thing I kind of think about is like, so in the ancient world, they didn't have a lot of really solid facts about like how the world actually worked with like atoms and virology and stuff like that. So they had a lot of like sort of developed knowledge of best practices around things like, animal husbandry and stuff like that, but they couldn't base it on an actual model that was universally accurate. But in the current time now, we're starting to get more and more, because of technology and offshoring and all that kind of stuff, like your day-to-day life is actually divorced from the things you would really need to know to survive. And so you can start to detach from that kind of like hard empirical truth stuff that you would need to know before we really got all this like technological support. All you need to know is how to get your paycheck and go to the grocery store to get your groceries. You don't even need to know where the food comes from. You don't need to know what a broccoli plant looks like at the farm. Like that stuff's all completely irrelevant. So you can start to get back to this place where, I don't mean this as a compliment, but get back to this place where the rhetoric or the medium is the message kind of attitude takes a lot more hold on people's lives.
Yeah, we had animal husbandry without theory, and it was because stuff worked, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, like they, by trial and error, you figure out like what you can and can't eat, and don't eat this mushroom and stuff like that. But why? Like, what molecule is causing the problem? Like, didn't know that, and so you couldn't use it to develop other ideas and stuff.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess you're right. That knowledge can be used, can be extended to other inferences, but it wasn't. That's kind of funny because then we retroactively. It's sort of almost like what Thomas Kuhn says about each revolution in science sort of erases the kind of the history, right? Because it no longer makes sense to read the history of the old paradigm because it's been subsumed in the new one, right?
But like, there's sometimes a lot of like knowledge that was bound up in those previous paradigms that maybe gets thrown away and shouldn't be. Like there's still like no model is perfectly descriptive of all aspects of reality. Like we get greater and greater sophistication, but some things need to be abstracted away for the model. I mean, the model is essentially a cartoon of what's actually happening. And I don't know, I've always been disappointed when we throw away some of that knowledge and say, like, make fun of it or ridicule it. And there was a lot of effort put into developing that knowledge, even if it was based on the wrong thing. And we shouldn't just throw it away.
Yeah, I agree. Like alchemy.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure which parts of alchemy are good, but yeah, I mean, I get your point.
Well, it has an interesting, it's sort of, if you follow those threads and those lines of thought, to what some of the, the implications of alchemy for early medicine might have been. Certainly a lot of mistakes, but also, maybe some insights that are no longer kind of at the forefront because our sort of the half a dozen things that we think about a particular model don't center those.
Or right. that becomes an issue of some of the problems we face now are how prior generations took two insane ideas like alchemy and medicine and put them together and then let the thing grow from there, or how Christianity subsumed Platonism and merged the two together and grew something from there. Was it really the best idea to take those two ideas, shove them together and grow something from it? Or would we have been better off if we grew something from either one idea or the other, or some other mixture of some other things? So, you take the big ideas and you push them together, and from a complexity perspective, what grows from there, and is that a good thing or not?
Yeah.
I mean, some of it's just the random combination of ideas, but also some of it's got to succeed in the human culture and mind of the time. So, yeah.
Yeah. So do the article. Go ahead.
Just a weird piece about, like, you know, indigenous technology and shamanism, where when we've been building, you know, like the Industrial Revolution and stuff, we have civilizations, if I don't know, maybe civilizations in quote, if you want to do that, where they've been spending time building, you know, technology of nature and exploring the soul and things like this. So you can take someone that struggled with PTSD for 20 years in Western medicine and gotten zero results, and take them down to Peru and let them have like a shaman experience in the forest that fixes their PTSD in the matter of, you know, a week. Just in thinking of like the way that we've looked at previous iterations of knowledge and then like, oh, that's just nonsense. And now we're getting to the point where, you know, all of a sudden psychedelic research is a hot topic again, and there are these cultures that are like, duh, like we've done this for 10,000 years. How come you didn't listen to us to begin with?
Yeah. So slight shift of topic. As we're talking, I'm looking at the chat, but I'm also looking at the notes in hypothesis on. Right now I'm looking at the Schmidt reading, and one thing that sort of jumps out at me, Chris, is, God, you use a lot of tags. You want to talk about your, I mean, at one point I think you've mentioned in previous weeks that you've got like 7,000 tags that you use.
At least. I'm probably actually somewhere upwards of 9,000, but a lot of them are singlets. So I try to, in part it's from, I have the benefit of doing all this digitally, so I don't have to worry as much as, you know, Melanchthon might have in keeping a commonplace book and worrying, where am I going to put this thing so I can possibly find it later? Or having the issue of, and I'm fairly certain it was, you know, roughly in the late 1680s that people started to create indices for their commonplaces so you could find things again. So I tend to add a reasonable number of tags for where might I find or see this thing in the future, so that if I'm searching for it, I can find the thing I know. And I even alias some tags too, so that they're intercross referenced. But what happens is once I take a note in hypothesis, it automatically gets put into Obsidian for me. And those tags become a layer level of, here's what exists and what's, you know, links things together in some sense. But then when I'm going from that, and to the extent possible, depending on what I'm reading and how core it is to some future project, I'll read and take more copious notes and try and make the note permanent from the jump. So if I'm reading something on orality and memory and anthropology, that stuff I'll go in super detail and pull out as much as I can with initial thoughts. And sometimes I'll even create in an annotation like 3 or 4 permanent notes that are inspired by the thing I'm reading and not even specific to the thing I'm reading. And then I'll tag the craziness out of it. And then once it's in my Obsidian vault, either once a day or once a week, I'll go through those, I'll clean them up and add specific links to specific other atomic ideas or permanent notes in the rest of the collection. And occasionally I'll remove a handful of those broader tags because I'll have better place that note into a group of notes or a space. So sometimes I may put a really high level note, like just memory or orality on it, to keep it in, like a planetary sphere, I guess, or within a universe, let's say. But then I'll concatenate that tag down to something smaller and more specific to bring it into a planetary sphere of orbit.
Chris, how long does the tidying up take if you're doing it each week? Like, what's the sort of sense of the kind of balance of ingesting, sorting, and tidying?
So there's, and part of it depends on how deeply I'm reading something. And there, everything I read, I tag it and put something on it, if for no other reason than to say, I read this thing, and here's the broad topic. And those are those may be fleeting notes that fly out there and I ignore them. But typically on books and journal articles, I'm spending more time on content that comes from those. And the richer the source, the more time I'll spend on it. So I triage it in some sense. And in a given week, I'll say, let's say I read, mostly this week I focused on smart notes and this book or these journal articles. I'm going to spend way more time processing those, because for me, for the end result, for some end goal I have in mind, those are going to be the more mission critical notes. Whereas the article I read about the Supreme Court yesterday, it's in and it's out. I'll remember enough of it, but I won't spend a lot of time on processing those notes, and they'll go into a folder. And if I need them later, I can recreate something out of them, or I might find some serendipitous thing 3 years from now that pulls it together. But otherwise, I'm going to focus more on the work rather than all the other stuff. But the other stuff occasionally will inform the work I'm doing. So, but if I'm reading something intensely, I tend to do as much work on writing the initial note at the time I'm reading as I possibly can. So literally the processing is 3 minutes of linking it to these 3 other ideas that I know are out there. And when I'm in Obsidian, I can look at the local graph and go out 1 or 2 layers and see what's around it, and decide based even on those simple tag keyword headings, oh, this idea and this idea are great. Or even when I'm writing the permanent notes, sometimes I'll write little reminders of link this to this idea specifically. And I know it's there, but I just don't know what the wiki link brackets specifically to put around it. So I let it slide and don't worry. But in doing that, the amount of time I spend processing after the fact goes way down. And for me, it's and where I see the mistake of people who are trying or saying they're using something in a zettelkasten mode, they're not putting the work into it. And the more work you can put in up front for here's the idea, abstract it and distill it down, the less work you'll have to do off in the long run. And then it's really more about linking it all together. And then once you've got everything linked, deciding, okay, here's a path through those links. Here's an article.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that has been sort of increasingly on my mind in the last week or so is, and I will say that I did, after last week's discussion, I did actually get a little rocket book. So I haven't used those before, but Stan convinced me that I want to try to use this instead of trying to write on my iPad. But the question still for me is, then where did these go? And so that whole process of it does seem to me that that, as I mentioned earlier, I've made a folder within my vault for this new research that I'm doing. And so I can have sort of the heat turned up under it, right? And so that it's easy for me to kind of focus and begin to see the connections. But I do feel like the next step for me really is to actually designate time to nothing but sort of sitting with the vault and thinking about the tasks that I want to do to connect things, and maybe, and maybe it is maybe that's why the gardening metaphor is really useful, is because there's a lot of work that kind of goes into to tending and weeding and and all of that. So is that really I think that's the thing, Tracy. I don't know if that's the zettelkasten method, but it is the thing that sort of continues to jump out at me about what, about all of those statements that Luhmann made about how he spends more time tending, and sort of processing and reviewing and massaging these notes than he does writing papers. And possibly that was an error on his part, because a lot of people have said that his papers were a little bit too had a little bit less connective tissue than they might have required between these ideas that certainly made sense to him, right? But again, that's an issue too, is that sort of. And I agree with what you were saying earlier, Tracy, about maybe one tool not being ideal for everything, right? And I have sort of thought about going back. I think I mentioned last week. I bought a new subscription to Scrivener, right? I had let that one kind of go by the wayside, and so and I'm thinking maybe that's actually the writing tool. Go ahead, Stan.
Dan, I think the Rocketbook is a good example of spending the time tending to your notes and spending rather than writing, because if once you get the hang of it, you can set the title of each of the individual files or each of the individual pages, which is how I do it. And I'll pick one or two keywords out of the page. So I don't worry about where it's going to fit in a Gestalt way. It's just a very incremental way. And then, take the picture, and then I have these collections, and then it goes into the vault. And, then you can look at them in the graph, and you can see, where the connections are. I remember last week we had this discussion, and you made the comment about, you kind of need to know, where they go. And I said, I'm thinking to myself, no, you don't really. It's really very incremental. And I think the whole point of all of this is, you make these incremental changes, and you spend time making these incremental changes, and eventually, in an emergent way, and I think Chris made the comment in Hypothesis, that the thesis of the overall document emerges. And at least for me, and I hope for you, you'll see that the Rocketbook is one tool that'll really help.
Cool, thank you. Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, I think one of the things I hadn't recognized before this class was the really breaking down the task of note taking into a bunch of separate tasks that need their own attention or their own space. Collecting the notes as you're reading is one thing, and then figuring out where they go is a separate thing, and then connecting them is another separate thing. And if you try to do it all at once in one step, yeah, you're kind of overwhelmed, and it's never possible. If you you did it right, you can't find it later. But if you queue them up and like, in the morning, review your notes and put them where they go and kind of get a workflow going. It starts to actually work a lot better than just like, well, I made a note, I got to figure out where it goes in the index and I got to connect it and I got to go make dinner so it's unfinished, or whatever. Like that was a pretty key insight for me. So like Stan was saying also, like you don't need to know where it's going to go when you take the note.
Right.
You figure that out later.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. It does seem like, it does seem like the notes that I've taken so far have been, it'll be interesting to see whether from a time management perspective, it makes more sense to have an automated process do this for me, or to just sort of kind of review them and put them where they need to go. As we were talking about that, Torin, do you want to talk a little bit about your workflow with Zotero and Research Rabbit? Because I really have fallen in love with Mike and the guys at Research Rabbit, and I love that tool.
I actually haven't really gotten into it yet, to be honest.
Okay.
See, I haven't really, with what I'm studying at the moment, I haven't really needed to find other papers and whatnot. So maybe when I get into level 2 of my degree, then I more than likely will be starting to have to learn how to use both Research Rabbit and Zotero together and so forth, as they get more guided work rather than the assignments I have at the moment.
Yeah, I've been having a lot of fun with it. Just from the perspective of, even in the I think they really kind of started in the sciences. But I do have, Plessy, I do have Readwise to send my notes from Hypothesis and from Kindle into Obsidian. And then I have, one of those long lists, and I think I put an example of it from SmartNotes in my, my personal folder. So then I have this long list, and I do tend to, I think that's kind of a thing that I've cracked the code of, is writing book reviews, right? And sort of, going through an entire book, looking at the entire argument of it, commenting as things, basically having a conversation with the highlights that I took and commenting on them and kind of crafting that into a review. The chore for me at this point, or the new process for me, is this process of taking individual ideas and distilling them down into permanent notes that are not the whole not the whole argument of a book. That's the easy one to do, right? But the little things along the way, which I think will be interesting, whether they're arguments or evidence. Those seem to be the two major ones that I'm involved with right now. That'll be valuable kind of going forward.
Yeah, I have sort of been developing my workflow with both Logseq and Rome, and then into Obsidian. So, because I use the two, I use a Logseq for my sensitive and project stuff, and Rome for everything else, especially for like the factoids of things that I'm interested in but don't relate to me at the moment, that I want to keep track of. And then when I want to put it into Obsidian, that's when I rewrite it into my own words as well, in my kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that's been interesting for me, because I've started, because a couple of weeks ago, right, I created this little format for myself for permanent notes, right, that had these things that I wanted to that I wanted to put in a permanent note. And then I started creating a bunch of permanent notes in this new little research area that I'm working on in this subfolder in the vault. And then I decided I was going to stick that out on publish, right? And now I realize that it doesn't make sense to a reader who has not been part of this conversation, to see these different elements of my, of my thing, right? And so I'm thinking again about, how that looks in sort of plain, straightforward English paragraphs. So what's going on in chat? Somebody explain to me this conversation.
Too much. It's too much to like follow the live chat and the chat. You can't do both. You're here for one or the other. I literally just called bankruptcy in the last 2 minutes because I can't follow all the threads.
Well, I was thinking as I was speaking and I saw this thing scrolling by, I was thinking, oh my God, this one I'm really going to have to go back and study in the same way that I kind of studied the vault. It's like, okay, time to do my daily practice on that too, I guess.
But somehow I hadn't thought of until today, because we've been taking the chat and dumping it into the vault. All this time we should have been adding double brackets to everything in the chat, so it's just automatically linked.
Right. I noticed you did that. I hope that works. I'm sure it will. I don't see why it wouldn't, right? Because it works for me in Readwise. So yeah, go ahead, Tim.
You were talking about Research Rabbit. The one big bugbear in there at the moment is you can only search within the collection. You can't search across the whole library, as it were. So if you've got a collection for, say, James Webb Space Telescope, and you've got a collection for this book, and you've got a collection for the other book, you can't actually see if there's any links because you can only search in one. That's apparently their biggest, highest level. Please make this work. So clearly that's going to happen soon. But what I have found is, particularly where I'm trying to do a short, quick blog type piece that is relatively current, whether it be James Webb Space Telescope or a breakup of a glacier or something, because it's so new, the things that I'm trying to quote and trying to link through aren't yet in Research Rabbit's database. So therefore, I now don't, oddly enough, don't ever actually look at this week's or this week's Science Direct or whatever. I sit back, and it might be in there, but it might not be. So give it a month, it'll turn up. And they focus much more on papers. They don't do paper collections. They don't do conferences that much, and they don't really do much of actual proper books, as it were. So that's a failing. Whereas obviously the current version of Zotero will take any type of document, and you can tell it, and it knows, or you have to tell it occasionally what type of document it is, because obviously Zotero came from a paper registration, as it were, a periodical. Now it doesn't. It will take a YouTube video just as easy as it will take a full proper article out of Nature. And that I see as being the tsunami, as it were, from the explosion of being able to get all this information, is the knock-on effect, the secondary items. And I don't know. I haven't bothered to look yet, but I haven't looked to see if you're there yet. in your own right, oddly enough, because it would be interesting to see whether your academic work is there, but your YouTube hasn't arrived yet, maybe.
Right.
Or your physically published book hasn't arrived, but your papers have. So, and of course, the primary link in Research Rabbit is who wrote this? Fred. What else does Fred do? Who wrote with Fred? And who's quoted Fred and who did Fred quote? So all that old-fashioned paper searches in citation indexes is gone. You know? Right. But it's the graphic user interface has had a slight tweak recently as well, and I think it's improved. I don't think it was bad before, but it's slightly smoother now. That's for sure. But it's crazy. You know, it was crazy. It would take me a morning to find 20 papers. Now it takes me 5 minutes. And it's like, what do I do with the rest of the day? I can write more, or read more, or come here more.
I've been actually kind of impressed with the amount of stuff that actually does find its way into these collections that Research Rabbit can search. I mean, and I have, it would be interesting if, and I think, you know, and I've been on a couple of those, you know, I've been on a couple of Zoom calls with Mike and the gang about, you know, kind of futures. And I think that they would like to, I mean, it's a question of, you know, of where they can find information, you know, and the quality of the metadata and you know, and all of that kind of stuff as well, right? But yeah, that would be sort of a quantum leap, right? If in addition to, and I did find they did find my book, so that was nice. They haven't, but only the academic book, right? Not you know, not a couple of self-published things that I've done, and certainly not, YouTube videos and you know, and blogs and other types of you know, of material that might be out there. I mean, I at some point, I suppose, you know, all of this information will be searchable, right? You know, it might take quantum computing to make that happen, you know, individually, and not just, you know, by some type of huge siren server like Google, right? But that might be, you know, one of the benefits of that development, right? Is that, you know, we won't have to depend on centralized indexing and search.
I was impressed when Zotero managed to move to that wider collection of documents as opposed to being a narrow things on white paper in periodicals. It went up to conference papers, it went up to books, and then it ended up with web pages as well, and all the way down to YouTube. So that, and therefore you've got things like we can pick up your YouTube stuff and link it into a Zotero collection, and Research Rabbit will take that automatically and then choke because it doesn't know YouTube yet.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is, yeah. So the next step would be the ability not only to add that stuff, but to find that stuff out there. Stan, go ahead, throw something in.
You know, I've used Zotero for a long time. You know, I have a very large database, but you know, there's a lot of talk about Zotero, but you know, the university is a Mendeley shop. Is there something special about Zotero that I'm missing, that's a connector with Obsidian, or, you know, can I just stick with Mendeley? I mean, is there anything anybody knows?
The biggest one the biggest issue between those in most academic spheres is about ownership of data and who has it and who's making money off of it. Zotero is an open source project that grew out of the Rosenzweig Center. And
Virginia, right?
you can roll your own and all the
George
data
Mason.
centers. If you want to use their paid services, you can. But in the case of Mendeley, it was and I actually know the founder reasonably well.
Elsevier.
But it was bought by Elsevier, and Elsevier bought it and then closed down huge chunks of it and have made it much, much harder for you to get your data out of it. So if you're in that space, you're owned by Elsevier the same way your university libraries subscription services are wholly dictated by them as a major player. So
right, yeah, okay. Well,
the E word is the big difference there.
Yeah, and that makes sense because our holdings are Elsevier, so that makes sense. Okay, so that makes it easy for me. Thanks.
Yeah, and that does have to do with sort of the level of buy-in usually that system libraries do to services like Elsevier or Thomson. I mean, I had EndNote for the longest time. I mean, I did my dissertation in EndNote, and now I don't have access to it because Thomson bought them. And then every year it was like, oh, $100. We got a new version, but it's a major upgrade. And so finally I let it go when I discovered Zotero, and I have been able to get the one thing that I haven't been able to get my notes out, but I have been able to get all my PDF attachments out at least. So I was able to retrieve all my articles.
The other thing that's worth noting too, because Zotero is open source, people have built some pretty sophisticated plugins so that if your repository is in Zotero, it's much easier to link it with plugins to your Obsidian vault. Whereas I don't think anybody would touch Mendeley with a 10-foot pole, or there's even a programming API interface that's, I haven't seen anybody dovetail Mendeley or any of the other tools really into Obsidian use at all. So
I think the open sourceness is a huge feature. Yeah.
The fact that the tools can work together is really one of the biggest benefits, especially if you're stuck with, it's the information overwhelm is bad enough, but to be overwhelmed with 80 tools to deal with your information makes it all the worse.
Yeah, I think I haven't really kind of followed the whole Zot file integration thing. Brian Jenks does a lot of explanatory work around that. I have really enjoyed the connection between Research Rabbit and Zotero. That has been fantastic. That's been very valuable for me because I have again, it's not perfect yet, but I mean, there's so much more available. And actually, for history at least, Research Rabbit has done a fairly good job of including monographs, which usually they're separate domains, right? You've got your WorldCat and you've got your your JSTOR or your Project Muse or whatever.
Yeah. I noticed here John Wilkins was saying he was using bookends, which I'm not familiar with. Maybe he can say something about that.
Well, I've been using bookends for a long time because, like Dan was talking about EndNote, it's kind of cut things off. I also used Papers long ago, and same thing happened, got bought out and messed it up. But bookends has a really interesting way of getting stuff into it. You can do searches within bookends that I haven't seen so well. And then you can do scans of barcodes of actual physical books to get things in, as well as any PDF. It will scan the PDF and do a search and get that in. So I like the input of it. And of course, it seems to be a little better integrated with citations, but there are downsides, and like I said in the note, I'm struggling between that and Zotero because I kind of like the layout of Zotero.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I haven't done as much. To be honest, I've been using Zotero for quite a while now, and I haven't really tried to automate the citation process. To the extent where I feel like I trust it to just do that for me. Yeah, I do think that is, it's interesting. I mean, it's ironically, it also has sort of kept me dependent on Chrome more than, I'd necessarily like to be. Because all of those things have Chrome extensions. I mean, Hypothesis similarly, right? So.
Yeah, it's one of the main reasons why I use Brave rather than Chrome or Firefox, because of all the extensions like Digo and Hypothesis and whatnot. Because I prefer to use Brave than Chrome. So.
Oh, is there a Hypothesis extension for Brave now?
Brave uses the Chrome store.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any extension you can get on Google Chrome, you can get in Brave.
Okay, good. I've downloaded Brave, but I haven't really tried to set it up and migrate to it.
If you're a Firefox user, I think it's Diego de la Hera in Spain has built a custom Firefox tool for it. If you ping me, I can give you a link to it somewhere. I use it occasionally. The problem with using two browsers, though, is if you have the tags are saved locally. So if you use one set of tags in one browser, that set is not copied. You can dig into the internals and copy and paste them across so that you get auto-populated frequent tags. But that's been a problem for me of cleaning tags up after the fact in using it in two different browsers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's it is very fiddly. I would and I guess that's the thing is I downloaded Brave for I guess ideological reasons and haven't followed up. So tells you about my level of commitment. Or maybe just time management. I don't know. So we are going to meet again one more time next week. Any last thoughts on these articles? We didn't spend a lot of time on the articles, but maybe that's just because we're over it. Tracy. All right. So so next week then maybe we'll maybe what we'll do then is talk more about, sort of less about the whole zettelkasten, Ahrens, Luhmann thing, and maybe more about the vault. Justin, what do you want to throw in?
I did want to comment on the articles, which I found that the compact and different projection of the ideas into those papers helpful in contrast to the Ahrens book for illuminating a couple different aspects, like and maybe it was just the contrast aspect of it. The things he highlighted were a little different. Each of those authors, well, Luhmann and one and Schmidt and the other, highlighted was different than what Ahrens did, and that was useful to me. I think what you were just saying about focusing on the vault next week would be nice too, because I've been checked out of there for a little while and I want to get back into stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Then that'll be the plan. And I will definitely add this chat into the vault immediately because it's got a lot of really good links in here and a conversation that I want to catch up with as well. All right, so thanks. And hopefully we'll be having hopefully we will be less concerned than we are today with the world situation. So thanks.
It looks like Simon is about to send us off with a little performance.
All right. It's a real room. Perfect. Excellent. Thanks a lot. Cool. Take care.
Have a good week. Bye.
Oh. Go ahead, Torrent. What?
Have a good week.
Okay, thank you. You too. Be well.